He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Just a heads up, listeners, this episode contains some adult language.
Previously on The Agency.
One of the things that you often think about in this is, they always say everybody has their price. And, I often used to think about, what is my price? What is it that would make me turn? But I was always conscious of the fact that they were the other side, that they were the baddies and that we were the goodies.
I'm not going to be in that room when the Five Eyes minus America, probably sit down and say, what do we do? Do we share Russia with him? Do we even claim that we're allies anymore? When he's doing this, what do we do?
How difficult is it to reintegrate to real life after living in the shadows?
I think it was much more difficult than I realised. I don't think I realised because for me it was my normal.
This is Kit Bennetts. He spent 6 years working in cover as a knock for America's Central Intelligence Agency on exchange from the New Zealand SIS in the 1980s. He says at the end of his time, as the nuclear ships route escalated between New Zealand and the US, going back to the SIS was hard because nobody quite understood the toll clandestine work took on the people doing it.
And that reintegration didn't go well.
I don't think it was my fault and I don't think it was their fault. I just think it was that no one understood. There were no psychologists, no one spoke to me. So, I didn't know why I didn't want to do it. I don't know why I was bitter about coming back to the service, but it was just so hard. And while I disliked the director, I don't think he understood either. So none of us understood.
And so over the course of a few months, the job went south for Kit Bennetts.
And I became difficult and intractable, and my marriage was collapsing, and it was a disaster.
Kit Bennetts says that in hindsight, the work he did for CIA, including that operation against Vladimir in the Philippines, left a mark on him psychologically.
I think that affected me a bit when I suddenly realised I was playing with the grown-ups. And there were one, possibly two other incidents that I really don't much want to talk to. I don't think it'll add anything, but they certainly were a bit traumatic. But I was gung-ho, I was fine, but I probably wasn't.
Ultimately, Kit Bennetts got into a personal clash with his boss, the director of the SIS.
I raised a middle finger and they ended up being paid to go away, and that was just fine. But I was kind of bitter, and they were bitter. They had suddenly a highly trained and skilled officer and they'd gone. But the fact is that they now put letters and names to these things, so I probably was suffering from something, PTSD or whatever.
But it would be another couple of decades before he would start to understand that. And it came after he'd taken on a new job in law enforcement. At the age of 51, Kit Bennetts enrolled as a frontline police officer in Australia.
Having been one of the youngest officers in a Western intelligence service, I became one of the oldest officers to pass through the Queensland Police Academy, and I worked in the Queensland Police, and I really did enjoy it. And I spent 5 years on the street, kicking and gouging in the mud and the blood and the beer.
In Brisbane, he was involved in what he describes as a couple of significant incidents. During one of them, he was badly beaten attempting an arrest. He was 56 years old.
A hand was smashed up and broken ribs, and subsequently discovered I had a broken leg as well. And when those sorts of things happened, then the HSOs would come and talk to you, you'd be getting emails, people would come and see you.
HSOs are health and safety officers, and so Kit Bennetts was put in touch with a psychiatrist.
This guy said to me, he was talking to me, he said, "Tell me about your childhood." And I thought, oh, here we go, when did you first start hating your horse?
Kit Bennetts says the psychiatrist could see something in him that he hadn't been able to see himself.
He said, no, what else have you done? Tell me what else you've done. And I said, I was in the intelligence world, in the wilderness of the mirrors for nearly 20 years. He said, what did you do in there? And I said, no, I'll have to kill you. So I tell you. And he said, did you do operational work? And I said, yeah. He said, were there interesting operations that you're involved in there? He said, yeah. He said, you've got some stuff sitting back there that's probably still evident, and it's come out because of this incident.
From Bird of Paradise and RNZ, this is The Agency. I'm Guy Espiner.
And I'm John Daniel. This is episode 6, The Price of Freedom.
I mean, it's the reality of the world. You have to have intelligence services, like you have to have a transport system.
Now, whatever you might think about that statement from a former spy, the people who actually run the country agree. Intelligence agencies are part of the critical infrastructure of government.
Yeah, this has been true of governments of all political stripes, hasn't it? It was interesting to see Jim Anderton, the head of the Alliance, and he was a big sceptic of the intelligence agencies over the years, certainly historically very critical of the SIS. When he came to power with Helen Clark's Labour government in 1999, after that, he had to grapple with the responsibility for the safety of the nation. He ended up agreeing that the intelligence agencies were essential. So in this final episode, we're going to dig into what this really means for New Zealand in terms of where these agencies sit in relation both to our government and New Zealand's place in the world today.
New Zealand has been part of the Five Eyes Alliance, alongside Canada, Australia, the US and the UK, for nearly a century now. And that alliance has given us a seat at the top table of the Western security networks, making us an important player relative to our size. But the world is changing, and there's no guarantee the future will be the same as our past.
We know the old order is not coming back. We shouldn't mourn it. Nostalgia is not a strategy.
That's Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney addressing the World Economic Forum in Davos in January 2026. Now, he didn't actually mention it, but the elephant in the room is very clearly the current US administration.
And the elephant trainer-in-chief, President Donald J. Trump.
That's right. Now, that speech was widely reported, but like a lot of things we've heard since the start of the second Trump presidency, it's hard to know just how much genuine structural change is happening behind the headline-grabbing rhetoric.
Well, in the last episode, we heard Susan Miller, a former head of CIA counterintelligence, saying Trump shouldn't be trusted on Russia. But she isn't the only former CIA officer to be concerned about the impact of President Trump on the Five Eyes.
I think it's dangerous. The standard story is we're beyond that. You know, he will come and he will go. And there's definitely truth in that.
Kip Bennett says what he finds concerning is that underpinning the Trump presidency, there seems to be a widespread appetite for the kind of America First politics that can shred alliances.
We have, over the years, felt deeply supportive of the United States. We've felt uncomfortable with some of the things we've done, but we've never, ever felt sorry for them. But we do now. And what troubles me is that just under 50%, it was never a landslide, but just under 50% of Americans voted to have it again. They'd seen it once, they'd seen the chaos it caused, and they voted to have it again.
Kit Bennett says there's no telling quite where this 4-year term will take the Five Eyes.
And this time, in the United States, there are no adults in the room, as there were when Bolton was there and when many of those other guys were there who could rein him in. They're gone now. He is surrounded by unstable isotopes. He is a man that doesn't have any principle, any guiding light, any moral compass, without going into all the emotion. He's the guy with the codes. And that's deeply concerning.
Tim Weiner, the New York Times security and intelligence specialist, agrees that the people at the top of the Trump administration lack the seriousness of their predecessors.
And the present person who is overseeing American intelligence services and the Five Eyes liaisons is a crackpot, a conspiracy theorist named Tulsi Gabbard. And she, recently decided that intelligence on the Russians would not be shared with the Five Eyes. This is madness. The people whom Trump has appointed, like Gabbard as director of national intelligence, like a fellow named John Radcliffe who's running CIA, Kash Patel who's running the FBI, and Pete Hegseth, former Fox News host, as Secretary of Defense. These people are amateurs, And they are crackpots and they are fools. And they are in charge of American national security. And that is a very dangerous thing, my friend.
Tim Weiner says there are real-world consequences that result from all this, and they could be disastrous.
The danger of Trump placing them in charge of American national security is that it increases the risk of another catastrophic intelligence failure. And, the people I talk to at CIA think that failure is coming. And they think it likely that it would not be a catastrophic, cataclysmic mass casualty attack like 9/11, but a series of successful political warfare operations by the Russians and the Chinese and other enemies of democracy to further weaken the American body politic, to further weaken our democratic tradition, and to push the president of the United States farther and farther toward the destruction of not only the architectures of national security that the United States and its allies set up after World War II, in large part to protect the world from Russian imperialism, but to, through these acts of political warfare, sabotage, subversion, espionage, to actually destroy our democratic system.
Tim Weiner says that chaos would present an opportunity.
I fear that if indeed the United States were struck again, at home or abroad, by a lethal terrorist attack, the President of the United States could well declare martial law and cancel the next election. And that is the great fear that I'm hearing from the people I talk to in the American intelligence community.
The actions undertaken by this new regime have already led to some erosion in terms of trust in the partnership. We know, for example, that British intelligence, they suspended sharing information in the Caribbean in the latter part of 2025 as the US ramped up a campaign supposedly against drug smuggling boats by blowing them up. And that appeared to be a flagrant contravention of international law.
And so, while there is a school of thought that this is all kind of business as usual for American interests, minus the usual hypocrisy, more and more people and governments, close allies of America, are concerned that Donald Trump's America is abusing its power to extract short-term gains for itself, and those will weaken the Western Democratic Alliance in the long run.
And there are multiple flashpoints that could turn very nasty. Internally, things like, as Tim Weiner says, US elections, or maybe immigration enforcement, that could blow up even further.
War with Iran might spiral out of control, if it isn't already, or the Americans might go back and push harder on Greenland.
Perhaps most likely, something that isn't even on anyone's radar right now.
Yeah, and look, realistically, here in New Zealand, we're not going to have much influence over any of those things. So let's try to understand where we can have an impact. First of all, if we're going to have these intelligence services, we want them to be good in every sense of the word. Kip Bennett says having good people is a crucial start.
And I am sufficiently idealistic to think that this is done by honest players. In New Zealand, it's done by honest players. I believe that the people in there are essentially good people. And that's a function of what you find in Western intelligence services, because that's a reflection of our society. And intelligence services have to be a reflection of our society, just like police services have to be a reflection of our society, like the military. And, the esteem with which New Zealanders hold the military in is not the esteem that a lot of countries hold their military in, because their military is turned on them from time to time.
Quite how you guarantee that is an open question. Oversight, that's vital, but a lot of it is going to come from the internal culture. Going back 50 years, Kit Bennetts remembers public mistrust of the SIS at its height after Dr. Bill Such was found not guilty of breaching the Official Secrets Act.
After the Such case, there was a demonstration outside 175 Taranaki Street.
That was the old SIS headquarters in central Wellington, where my mother used to work. Kip Bennett says he found himself with a small handful of people, including the deputy director at the time, Ron Biggs, looking down on a large crowd.
So we were up in the director's office looking down at 10,000 people. That's a lot of people protesting. And Ron said, "This is why we do this job, Kit. because all those people are going to go home tonight and go off to parties and go home tonight, and nothing is going to happen to them. They think we're in here photographing them. We're not. But that's why we do this job. And I always thought that's right. Maybe a bit idealistic, but that's exactly right. And lots of countries don't have that. So we have that. And, you know, the song says you don't know what you got till it's gone.
Ultimately, politicians are responsible, not simply for running our intelligence agencies, but the extent to which they are intertwined with our allies. In 2010, WikiLeaks published cables intercepted between the US Embassy in Wellington and the State Department in Washington. The US ambassador at the time described New Zealand as split into two camps when it came to our view of the US. First worlders, effectively a pro-US faction who he said were made up of defence, intelligence, foreign affairs, business leaders and a few politicians.
Yeah, basically the foreign policy establishment. While the opposition, they were made up of what's called otherworlders, media, academics, most politicians and a large part of the public who are sceptical of American power and who see New Zealand as non-aligned. Now, obviously, this analysis was never supposed to be made public, and there was a fair bit of moaning about it as a meaninglessly shallow characterisation, but in some ways it is a useful shorthand. And that division goes to the fact that while many in New Zealand have been sceptical of American power for decades now, we do remain very much part of the American sphere of influence.
And there's a spectrum of responses here, from thinking this is groupthink gone mad to seeing it as experts who have a strong, responsible hand on the tiller because they're the people who have to actually run national security.
Yeah, those are the extremes. The lines here are a bit more blurred or perhaps nuanced than you might imagine. Here's Kip Bennetts again, this time talking about one of the prime ministers under whom he served in the 1980s when we were supposedly breaking up with the Americans over our anti-nuclear policy.
With the nuclear thing, the politicians operated at two levels. Men as smart as David Lange, for example, operated at two levels. So they knew that the intelligence services were doing what they were doing and expected you to do what they were doing. They were expected that our liaison would remain strong. But they had a political card to play as well. So, you know, David Lange was quite close with directors of the service. I mean, as were all ministers, there is a kind of a pragmatic side to them, but they're not going to ever reveal that.
Many years after he'd stepped down as Prime Minister, David Lange told a journalist that New Zealand had helped win the Cold War, but he wasn't allowed to tell anyone about it.
And that might well have been a reference to the story of the Czech embassy raid that we covered in the service.
Yeah, we're going to come back to this a little bit later on, but in the first episode, we heard from another Labour politician, Andrew Little, who was the minister in charge of the intelligence agencies for 6 years from 2017 to 2023. And when we spoke with him in September of 2025, he said he was confident Five Eyes would be strong enough to continue in spite of the current turmoil.
It's been through American political tumult before. I mean, this, look, maybe we all think what has happened today is different to what happened 40, 50, 60 years ago. I mean, what is happening now is, I think, a cause for worry just about the general sentiment and move which is undermining democracy. But I'm equally confident that the Five Eyes relationship will endure through that, and without agencies like ours, and indeed the other partners, compromising their principles, their requirement to respect democracy and freedom of expression and all those sorts of things, I think the Five Eyes arrangement will survive.
But Andrew Little does sound a note of caution in terms of how we deal with the Trump regime.
I think given their obligations under the New Zealand legislation, they've got to act independently and they have to think carefully about their own legal and human rights obligations before sharing intelligence. I'd be surprised if they weren't actively considering how they share intelligence in the current conditions.
And Andrew Little had another caveat, that Five Eyes should stay in its lane.
It started out as an intelligence sharing relationship. That's what it should remain. It's very good at that. We have good legislation, I think, that provides good constraints on it and oversight of it.
He's echoing criticism around mission creep that was made by the former Prime Minister Helen Clark and others. That sense that the Five Eyes has been quietly expanding its remit into foreign affairs and defence. But you have to ask, how realistic is that? Is it possible to have an intelligence gathering network that stops at the door of foreign affairs and the military?
Yeah, even in an area like immigration, which at first glance seems a long way from those concerns, New Zealand is part of an international alliance that shares information around national security related to immigration. This one is called M5, Migration 5, but the members are the same as Five Eyes.
Yeah, then there's the Critical Five. That's Five Eyes members collaborating on critical infrastructure. And during the early days of COVID, the Five Eyes were working together on health outcomes. There's another one I came across too, and I hadn't heard of this until I started looking into this podcast. It's called FALEG. I've never heard it said out loud, but I presume that that's how you say it. It stands for Five Eyes Law Enforcement Group. Now, again, mutual national security interests based on trust that comes from this long-standing alliance. And as you see, the tentacles are spread rather wide. It's worth noting, I guess, though, that this particular one, the law enforcement one, means that New Zealand police find themselves part of an interagency network that includes not just the FBI, but also ICE, the very controversial American Immigration and Custom Enforcement Agency. Again, these systems have existed under governments from both left and right.
And we've seen that the Central Intelligence Agency doesn't operate in a vacuum. They're going to work with their military and domestic and foreign affairs in a coordinated way to push forward political aims laid down by the government.
Yeah, and we've seen recently with news of the death of a New Zealand SAS soldier training alongside US Special Forces in Papakura that we are very tight on defence.
Yeah, and there was a Nikki Hager story on Newsroom about the discovery of papers at a Salvation Army thrift store that detailed a meeting in London about the interlinking of our military with other Five Eyes partners in preparation for conflict with China. Now, these aren't coincidences. While it's true that we run training exercises with a number of countries, it's not as if we run them with China or Russia or North Korea or Iran. We're part of the Western Bloc, so broadly speaking, we're allied with our intelligence partners, although we probably retain a bit of wiggle room around foreign affairs.
Kit Bennetts says the ties that bind us to our partners are vital and they're pulled together by the people on the ground.
There's that connective tissue between the intelligence agencies.
Yeah.
Your exchange is part of that.
Yep.
We know of other people who were with ASIO.
Yeah.
We know people from the service who've gone to MI6 as well.
Yep.
So that connective tissue has been strong in the past.
Yep.
What sort of healthiness, how important is it that is healthy?
It's critically important. And in much the same as countries cooperate, all we ever see and hear is the politicians. But below that, all the links between defence, for example, and other Five Eyes partners, other allies and things, these run deep. And that's what I think. Everyone's hunkering down and waiting for the madness to end so we can go back to being, having grown-ups in the room. And I'm sure that's what's happening. I'm sure that those ties are strong, if not stronger than when I was there. I hope I'm right.
The problem is from an outsider's viewpoint, is that, as you say, the political bit is what's visible.
Yes.
And so now we're talking about, what Trump almost refers to as the deep state.
Yes.
Holding itself together and holding these other parts, So you're talking about something that's invisible in America, dealing with something that's more or less invisible in New Zealand.
Yes. And there is a deep state. He's absolutely correct, it's a deep state, but it's not a malevolent thing. It's the thing that keeps the country going. It makes sure that, that we have hospitals that work and the roads are repaired and all of those things. That's all done by the deep state. Politicians aren't involved in that. What he's done is made it sound like it's malevolent and made Washington sound like a swamp. And, it just isn't true. And it isn't true in New Zealand either, but it is like an iceberg. The very tip of it is what we see, and underneath is what makes the system work,
Former Soviet ambassador turned defence and security academic, Professor Ruben Azizian, has seen some turmoil in his time. And when we spoke with him in November of 2025, he was relatively sanguine about the situation with the US.
I wouldn't overreact to Mr. Trump's impact and influence for a couple of reasons. One is the US is still a democracy.
Professor Azizian says governments come and go, but these kinds of long-standing organisations tend to survive because once they're built, it's hard to dismantle them.
Secondly, I know that from a bureaucratic point of view, dissolving an organization is a very hard thing to do. You can always find a reason for doing something else that will be based on common interest.
And he says in that sense, it's more likely that Five Eyes will evolve in another direction because they've got a common concern with the rising superpower.
Five Eyes, I think it has its purpose. I mean, intelligence is about collaboration between countries that trust each other historically, culturally, in terms of their military partnership. So to me, there is no sign yet that any of the five countries is moving away from that framework or political or military thinking. So there will be tensions and issues. Whether it continues to be Five Eyes or will be more eyes, I don't know. For example, I expect more eyes rather than fewer eyes because there are other, if it is also about trying to understand, using a very mild term, and react to China, then there are other countries in immediate neighborhood of China who wouldn't mind. I'm thinking maybe Japan, for example, or France, potentially, who could be interested in some kind of engagement with Five Eyes.
And we'll come back to China. There are, in fact, already extensions to Five Eyes. There's Nine Eyes. They cooperate on signals intelligence. That's to Five Eyes plus Denmark, France, the Netherlands and Norway.
Japan is also considered a close ally of the Five Eyes partnership. In 2020, the Japanese defence minister described Japan as being close enough to the other partners to be able to refer to the organisation as Six Eyes. There's even a 14 Eyes that adds in a number of European countries as well. And Ruben Azizian says all of these additional frameworks are broad positives for New Zealand, giving us something we'd never have on our own.
When a small country is in an intelligence pool with some more influential, resourceful countries who want to share some intelligence information, generally speaking, it's an advantage for the smaller country because the smaller country otherwise wouldn't necessarily have access. Again, we know that not all of our information is spread equally. There are issues there. There are kind of firewalls and all of that, but still. Secondly, small countries are generally interested in being part of some kind of a multilateral arrangements because in a multilateral, you have an opportunity to have your voice heard.
Professor Azizian says New Zealand needs to push forward some of its own natural advantages.
You can bring all these countries, leaders of intelligence communities to whether Queenstown or somewhere, and also this is a reputational thing.
Yeah, you can hear him smiling about Queenstown, but I don't think he's joking. And it is interesting. Ruben Azizian has attended and hosted a lot of international conferences over the years. He knows how goodwill is earned. And he understands the subtleties of pushing back together against someone throwing their weight around.
You can also use multilaterals to align and cooperate with some in the Five Eyes on issues where you don't necessarily agree with others in the Five Eyes, particularly the dominant power.
Ruben Azizian says that while there's an agreement in place between the Five Eyes not to spy on each other, everyone else is fair game.
In a world that is increasingly hard-nosed around security, there's no point in being too precious about the basic necessity of spying.
I think everyone has to agree, whether we like it or not, that in the intelligence world, there are basically no untouchable friends, if I say. We know that countries have spied on each other. You read Merkel's book and how she was spied on by the United States. I can say same back to Russia situation. Russia and China are very tightly connected today, but there are Chinese spies being caught in Russia. No, that's not publicized, but that's the reality. And I'm sure Russia continues to do spying in China and elsewhere. So if we agree with the cynicism of intelligence work as an important part of foreign policy making, then I think Five Eyes should be kept and New Zealand has a place in it.
But at the same time, Ruben Azizian says that as a democracy, we need a more open and transparent discussion around foreign policy rather than keeping it inside the corridors of power. And that's been the case for too long.
So you have to make that foreign policy discussion more open, more transparent. It's not just about respectful professionals in MFAT or an experienced minister. It is a time, I think we are at the crossroads, which way we go. And we need a major discussion and debate.
He says issues like Pillar 2 of AUKUS, the defence alliance between three of our Five Eyes partners, including our closest ally, Australia, these really need to be discussed in public and not just hammered out behind closed doors.
We don't have a foreign policy strategy as such. The documents that are produced by MFAD are produced by MFAD with some experts, but we need a public conversation because we know that there will be time when the AUKUS Tier 2 thing will be resolved one and the other.
Ruben Azizian says in the current climate, there's a real danger to running a foreign policy that doesn't bring the public along with it. He says whatever is decided won't satisfy everyone because we're a democracy, but we do need to feel like it has been openly discussed.
We don't want a foreign policy issue to become too explosive for this country. And to avoid that, we need some level, I mean, we can't have a full consensus, some level of consensus and understanding about what New Zealand should be. And do we just follow Trump or we do something different?
We put this to Andrew Little, who was the Minister for the Intelligence Agencies and Minister of Defence as recently as 2023.
You're on the record as saying it's really important that New Zealand has healthy conversations around this sort of stuff, around the threats. Yep. And you've named Russia, China and North Korea as being in particular places, the kinds of places that we need to look out for. The issue for me is that in order to have that conversation, we need to be able to have the information in the first place, right? And we don't seem to be able to get levels of information around this stuff. I mean, when we were doing the service, for example.
For clarity, John's talking here about our previous podcast series, The Service. That was about a Cold War raid on the Czech embassy, carried out by Britain's MI6 and New Zealand's SIS, also known as The Service.
We went to the service and asked for confirmation. Ultimately, it appears that they lied to us. Now, they're allowed to do that according to the bill, right? Am I right about that?
Yeah, in the SIS Act, there is a clause which says that they're allowed to lie. I picked through it one day. There's several hundred pages, but they are allowed to lie.
They're allowed to. There's specific provisions about concealing their activity.
Yeah, basically it seems they got hold of Gerald Hensley, who had oversight of the operation, and turned him.
That's right. It looks like they turned our main source and then ran him back at us.
Yeah, we asked him about this story 3 times, and each time the answer was different.
So when you say that you have a dim recollection that there was an operation involving the Czechoslovakian embassy, do you recall it being a successful operation?
No, you're pressing me on this one, Guy, and harder than I can go. I've really said all I can on this one. John, I have to go to you.
Sure, we should. We'll turn off the recording devices.
Yeah.
And then we can come back.
Yeah. Okay. What I want to ask you was, I haven't talked to the service about this for years and years.
So we turned off the tape and had a quick chat off the record, and then turned the tape back on.
And just a reminder, the aim of the raid was for a small team of SIS and MI6 operators to get these code books used by the Warsaw Pact countries, copy them and return them undetected to the safe of the Czech embassy in Wadestown.
And did they get the books?
That I no recollection of.
No recollection of at all?
No, none at all.
6 months later, having had plenty of time to communicate with the service, he told that story quite differently.
Yes, it's a long time ago, and but I do have fairly clear recollection that it failed, that we didn't get our hands on the books.
I mean, come on. Now look, don't get me wrong. I like Gerald Hensley, who sadly passed away in 2024. I enjoyed his company. He was smart and funny, and he had an extraordinary career as a civil servant and diplomat, but he also loved the spy game. And I believe he was, as more than one former SIS officer has said to me, also a dreadful, unconvincing liar, at least in this case. And when I rang him to say that we were entertaining the possibility he might be lying, Gerald Hensley laughed and laughed and laughed, and he said he thought that was very wise.
Which is ironic, right? Because we hear a lot from the intelligence agencies about the dangers of misinformation and disinformation. But if you're right about this, they do it when it suits them.
I guess the purpose of intelligence agencies is they do act covertly.
And in the end, I suppose you could ask, isn't that just the way it has to be? Certainly Andrew Little thinks so, and he's the one who's sat in that hot seat.
I mean, they're required to do an annual threat assessment, published annual threat assessment, which they do, and that is public. But there's always going to be, because of the nature of their work, there's always going to be limitations on what they disclose at a particular time, and maybe 50 years or 100 years hence. That stuff is maybe open to disclosure, but it's always about protecting methods today, sources today, intelligence today, so that they can more effectively, where they see a threat, respond to it.
So we're back here again, trying to square the circle. We need intelligence agencies to defend our democracy, but they say they need to do that in secret, and that can feel anti-democratic. Kip Bennetts is alert to the risks of keeping the public in the dark.
I'm a long way away from intelligence work nowadays, but, you know, I do understand first principles. But one of the things that I think you have to do is you have to be able to justify your position. And I think in many respects, from what I read about what's happening in New Zealand, that I think the service does a pretty good job. But you've got to stay on that all the time, because if you lose the faith of the people in a modern society, you know, it's very dangerous. And intelligence services, you've got to have them.
He says as times have changed, there's been something of a shift in public expectation.
In the past, in my time, people would say, well, you know, what is the SIS doing for its money? Well, we can't tell you that. It's a secret, I'm afraid. And in those days, people would say, well, that's fair enough, I suppose that's what they do. Nowadays, the new generation says, yeah, that's all very well, but what are you doing? Oh, well, we can't tell you that. Well, okay, well, we could probably spend the money on health and education. You know what I mean?
We can accept that there's always going to be tension around what the intelligence services can and can't tell us, but it is frustrating. We do know that those ties between SIS and CIA remain tight.
We know that New Zealand SIS has certainly historically had a close relationship with CIA.
We're talking here with Susan Miller, the former high-ranking CIA officer.
Did you have any experience of working with the New Zealand SIS?
Oh, absolutely. I came down there. I even met your, it was a female prime minister. I met.
Oh, it might have been Jacinda Ardern, was it? Oh, was it Jacinda Ardern?
Yeah, that's who it was.
Yeah,
that's
okay.
who it was.
Yeah. Oh, so recently, yeah.
It was when I was down. I was talking about China. It wasn't when I was head of counterintelligence. I do remember talking to Kiwis and other Five Eyes more at headquarters about counterintelligence when I was there before, you know, during this period with Trump. But, you know, it was later, when I was head of China Mission Center, I got to talk to her. She's lovely.
In late 2021, so under the administration of former US President Joe Biden, CIA announced it was establishing a mission center to specifically target the People's Republic of China. The then CIA director, William Burns, said its purpose was to, quote, further strengthen our collective work on the most important geopolitical threat we face in the 21st century, an increasingly adversarial Chinese government.
Now, you have to say, it's quite interesting that Susan Miller, the person who heads up that new CIA mission centre targeting our largest trading partner, gets FaceTime with the New Zealand Prime Minister. And of course, that connection is one that comes through our intelligence alliance, where New Zealand does seem to be adding value.
And your team there, it's a very small group that works in your intelligence service. They are righteous. I mean, these guys are super smart. Feel like I was talking to somebody who'd been trained, together, and yet we aren't. We do a lot of stuff together, but whoever invented the Five Eyes is right, and we need to keep it going.
Yeah, although, again, it is slightly frustrating how little we really know about this. And it's worth mentioning that when we put together Red Line, our podcast series trying to grapple with Chinese influence here in New Zealand, we approached the service on background and then went out to try to interview other people. But they turned around and told the entire New Zealand intelligence community not to talk to us.
You're not bitter about that, are you, John?
Well, listen, the guy from the New York Times seems to know more about our intelligence agencies than we do. Here's Tim Weiner again.
The Kiwi Intelligence Service punches far above its weight. It is particularly adept against the Chinese target at assessing the intentions and capabilities of the Chinese military and the Chinese spy services. And it is a vital part of the Five Eyes system, which is essentially an intelligence sharing system in which signals intelligence, that is electronic eavesdropping and espionage primarily, is shared among the five nations in the compact. And the CIA depends on its liaison with foreign intelligence services to understand what is going on in the world.
This is another important point to understand. While the Trump administration doesn't seem massively invested in its European partnerships where countering Russia is top of mind, the US is focusing on its rivalry with China.
And New Zealand has something to offer.
The CIA is only about 22,000 people strong. Fewer than half of those people are actually spying overseas. We're American. We don't have the languages or the country knowledge to spy on the entire world. So these liaisons, the Five Eyes system, almost chief among them, are essential to the CIA and indeed to the national security of the United States.
That doesn't mean the road ahead will be straightforward.
So I don't know where this is going to go with regard to Five Eyes.
This is Susan Miller again. She says even if we can't trust President Trump on Russia, and even though she too is evidently sceptical of those political appointees at the top of the intelligence and defence agencies who are very much Donald Trump's people, our people should keep in touch, keep up the dialogue, and keep working together.
I would recommend that they do talk, because we've got to keep that door open, keep the door open to anybody, his chief of CIA, his secretary of state, his head of the Pentagon, whatever. Keep all those doors open.
But Susan Miller says intelligence sharing is now something of a political calculation. The New Zealand intelligence community is going to have to make ongoing risk assessments around what kind of information to pass on to their American colleagues.
Also remember who the ultimate person is going to see the report from that meeting, if it's at that high level. If it's a lower level person, it's, not necessarily going to go to him. But, the thing is that when your leaders are talking, I'm sure it's already on their mind. I'm not telling you anything that I don't think they're already thinking. And so, unfortunately, and as an American, that makes me sad.
We should remember that even at the height of the row between the US and New Zealand over nuclear ships in the mid-1980s, intelligence was shared and cooperation continued. By early 1986, Kip Bennetts had finished his time with CIA but was still with the SIS. He was based in Wellington.
I was then the head of the research and analysis part of the Soviet. By then I was completely disillusioned. I wanted to get out and I hated everybody. But one of the things I was on a joint defence committee, and we would look at where Soviet maritime stuff was, where ships and submarines and all that sort of stuff were, whether they were in our vicinity and that sort of thing. We were working on intel from the Brits and the Americans and the Australians and the stuff that our Orions would be doing.
Because Soviet subs did come.
They did come. Oh yeah, they did. Yeah, they did. Yeah, they did stooge around.
Did they?
Yeah.
Never mind the submarines. A little after 5:30 p.m. on February 16, 1986, the Soviet cruise liner Mikhail Lermontov hit a rock in the Marlborough Sounds. Apparently, the pilot had taken it too close to the shore because he wanted to give the passengers on board a better view. By 10:30 that night, the ship had sunk. A Soviet crew member died. Kit Bennetts and the SIS still had tight links with the CIA.
We had this emergency meeting the next morning, and the Americans had got onto us, and I was sent to this meeting, and I was allowed to demand things. So I went to the meeting and said, well, this is what we want. All Soviet vessels have what we used to call the war plans, but the ship's commissar would have in his safe the envelope that you open in case the balloon goes up and what the ship has to do, because it's a Russian flagged ship. And obviously the Americans were keen to get a hold of that if they could.
Well, the Lermontov, as a passenger ship, wouldn't have been involved in any fighting. That information carried in the ship's safe would help Five Eyes intelligence agencies understand more about potential Soviet war plans.
We needed to get the Navy diving team down, so they flew the Navy diving team down from Auckland. So there's a couple of Herc captains that owe me a beer big time because they had to fly them low level because they were going to go down. They couldn't fly them high.
Given that the Navy divers were going to have to dive to an unknown depth, they couldn't be submitted to the pressure of flying at high altitude.
So they came down at between 300 and 500 feet all the way down to Marlborough. And I bet they didn't go out to sea. I bet they spent their time over the land, flying the naval team down there.
But as the divers arrive in Wellington, so do the survivors from the Lermontov.
Then we found out from television, because they provided the best intel, when they had the photographs taken by the press of the guys coming off the ship, there was the KGB resident with the ship's commissar.
The ship's commissar was a political appointee who oversaw crew discipline and security on all Soviet vessels. If he'd had to abandon ship before he could get to the safe, the papers might still be down there. But that wasn't what happened.
And the ship's commissar had his briefcase, and we knew that's what he had got. The American said he won't leave the ship without it, but you never know. We should be ready to dive on there just in case he didn't.
I guess the point here is that just because we can't see something doesn't mean it isn't important.
I see what you did there. Very clever. Like, we all need to pay attention to what's happening beneath the surface.
That's right. The world of espionage, the wilderness of mirrors, it does invite a metaphor.
It does. And look, this has been a hell of a story. These spy games that play out in the shadows, we've been able to see how they're played by real people for high stakes and with a real world impact that spreads out across the political landscape.
And we are now in a period of geopolitical turmoil, potentially even upheaval. And as a nation, we need to ask ourselves some hard questions about who our friends really are and about how we work with them.
Is this the bit where you lecture me about the difference between spycraft and statecraft?
You love it when I do that.
I do.
I have heard Russian statecraft under Vladimir Putin described as an extension of KGB tradecraft. But listen, it's also this situation with Trump. I mean, we can't just ignore what's going on there, given what we know.
No, although it's interesting, right? I mean, pretty much everyone we spoke with, and they do come at this from multiple different angles, they were all clear that they felt we need to stay in Five Eyes.
At the same time, I'm always sceptical when I hear there is no alternative. It feels like there's an internal logic that's built up over decades inside our security institutions where being aligned with America is just a no-brainer because of those massive US resources. And look, that might be understandable.
Yeah, I mean, the calculation has been pretty simple, right? It's always felt safer under the wing of America than pretty much anywhere else.
Yeah, but the people in power haven't really taken the time to explain that to the public because it's politically awkward, given that the US, they just get it wrong sometimes. Now, those smart people in the corridors of power, they must be wondering, how much worse would it have to get with President Trump before something breaks?
Yeah, these are hard questions, and we do need to be able to discuss them and think about them as a society, right? Hopefully, this has been the kind of story that helps us bring some of those elements into the light where we can all see them. Because while the story of Kit Bennetts and his time with the CIA, a Kiwi at the heart of American intelligence operations, it took place 4 decades ago or so now, there's every chance something similar is still going on today. Remember what Andrew Little told us in the first episode.
There are exchanges, I suppose, probably for want of a better word.
We approached the SIS about this. They use different language, but essentially they confirm that yes, a, quote, small number of staff are posted offshore in liaison roles, end quote. They say that relationships with overseas intelligence and security partners, particularly Five Eyes, are vital to New Zealand's national security. And when we asked about any changes in that Five Eyes dynamic since the election of the second Trump administration, they did note that the global environment continues to be dynamic. They said the intelligence sharing partnership continues to function largely as it always has. So, not quite business as usual, but close. And that underlines just how useful it's been to hear this story about the specifics of that relationship. Anyway, just to wrap up, Kit Bennetts did end up finding his way out of the wilderness of mirrors. He never became an actual fighter pilot.
No, but he still has the photos that made him very much look like one, to the GRU at least.
He also managed to get the girl. For more than 30 years now, he's been happily married to Jackie, who he first knew when he was a schoolboy in the Wairarapa. They've had adventures all over the place, lived in Papua New Guinea for more than a decade where he worked with an airline.
Yeah, then after he was a cop in Brisbane, getting beaten up on the front line in his 50s, he decided to put a PhD to good use, so Dr. Kit Bennetts now lectures at universities in Australia and China in aviation and business. He'll be, 75 this year?
And in spite of the sense that it didn't end the way he would have liked, and he regrets the damage to the relationships around him, Kit Bennetts says he wouldn't change his time with CIA.
I mean, I can see it in your eyes. I mean, you loved that time.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it was wonderful. You know, I really got that. That's the sharp end. You know, everyone thinks that it's James Bond and fast cars and that sort of thing, but really doing what I was doing recruitments in place, you know, or attempting recruitments in place, that's the glamour end of human. It definitely is. And there I was, kid from Masterton doing this. And as I say, the vocational guidance officers never mentioned that opportunity to me. So, yeah, and I loved it. I regret not a moment of it.
The Agency was produced, written and hosted by John Daniel and me, Guy and Espinham. Our executive producer for RNZ was John Hartevelt, and our executive producer for Bird of Paradise Productions was Noel McCarthy.
Original music by Anthony Tonnen, graphic design by Oliver Wall. For RNZ, sound production and final mix was by Mark Chesterman. Production coordinator was Brianna Uritich-Gregg. Thanks to Steve Burridge, Ali Marsden, Jeremy Ansell and William Saunders. Thanks to Megan Whelan, and thanks also to Susan Baldacci.
The visual director at RNZ was Cole Eastham Farrelly, and our camera operator was Jess Charlton. Thanks also to Sarah Gaetanos for the article about Bill Such that appears on rnz.co.nz.
Thanks also to CNN, TVNZ, BBC, the ABC, Universal and Paramount. To read more about the documents and articles we've mentioned, you can go to rnz.co.nz/The Agency, and you can see the links in the show notes.